So after leaving the white supremacist skinhead movement, he helped build in the 1980s and 90s. Christian began a painstaking process of rebuilding his life. He graduated from DePaul University. He's an Emmy Award-winning television producer, an acclaimed author, as you'll see, and a noted public speaker. Most notably, in 2010, Christian co-founded Life After Hate, a nonprofit made up of former far-right extremists that are dedicated to helping people exit violent hate groups. In 2015, Christian published his memoir, Romantic Violence, Memoirs of an American Skinhead, where he details his involvement in and ultimate exit from the early American white power skinhead movement. So Christian, thank you for being with us, and the stage is yours.
My journey started 21 years ago when I left the American neo-Nazi skinhead movement that I helped build. I was only 22 years old at the time, but I had already spent 8 years, every single one of my formative teen years, in America's first neo-Nazi skinhead gang. But before that, I was a relatively normal teenager. I kind of looked like Chachi a little bit. No, I don't. I loved to play sports. I loved to chase girls. But like most other teenagers, I had low self-esteem and low self-confidence. And I really wanted to matter. So when I was 14 years old, contemplating my life, I was standing in an alley, and a 1968 Firebird came roaring down the alley, spitting up gravel and rocks and dust, and it stopped 6 inches from where I was standing. And a man with a shaved head and Doc Marten boots came out of that car, and he looked at me as I was smoking the joint, and he said to me, as he pulled the joint out of my mouth, "Don't you know that that's what the communists and the Jews want you to do to keep you docile?" I was 14. I didn't really know what a communist was, except for the guy in the Rocky movie that I loved. I didn't know if I had met a Jewish person at that point in my life, and I hardly knew what the word docile meant. It's true. But what I was struck by was the charisma and the strength that this man had, or that I perceived he had. This man was Clark Martel, America's first neo-Nazi skinhead, who had lived right across the alley from where I grew up. At a time when I was the most vulnerable, where I was developing my identity, where I was breaking free from my parents' influence, I really didn't know who I was. What I did know was that my parents were Italian immigrants who came to the United States in the mid-1960s, and that they were often the victims of prejudice. So it wasn't something that I was raised at home with. It was something that I learned. But while I could sit here and tell you that I was drawn in by the ideology at first, I wasn't. For me, it was a sense of belonging, a sense of family, because when my parents came to this country, they knew they had to work very, very hard to support their family. So they were at work in a small beauty shop that they opened on the south side of Chicago, 7 days a week, 14 hours a day. And because of that, I spent a lot of time on the street. And I felt lonely. I really missed my parents. I wouldn't have admitted it then, but I felt abandoned. So I went in search of a new family. And when I found them, over time, the ideology came into play. I was promised paradise. You might recognize that, Jesse. I was told that if I were to belong to this new family, I wouldn't get bullied anymore, I wouldn't be marginalized, and that I would be fighting for something noble and heroic. That's how it was pitched to me at 14 years old. And at 14 years old, I grabbed it, and I willingly went along. Within 2 years, by the time I was 16 years old, the man who recruited me, Clark Martel, which is, ADL is very familiar with him. I remember reading about him in 1987. He went to prison for a series of violent hate crimes, one of which was a very brutal attack on a girl who was also a skinhead at the time, but her friends had seen her at a bus stop with a black gentleman. So they went to her apartment and they beat her within an inch of her life, and then they painted a swastika on her apartment wall with her own blood. Luckily, they went to prison for that, because many of them didn't go to prison for what happened just a few months before, where on the 49th anniversary of Kristallnacht, they went around Chicago, and like the Germans did, they broke windows of Jewish-owned shops and spray-painted swastikas on synagogues. What happened, though, when I was 16 was my mentor went to prison. And there was a lack of leadership because all the older skinheads at that time were also arrested and went to prison. So I stepped into the shoes of the person I thought I wanted to be. And very, very quickly, I was able to ramp up our activities and recruit dozens more people to our movement, and instilled in them the same fear that was instilled in me when I was the most vulnerable, that we needed to fight against our enemies. And our enemies, of course, were the Jewish people and the US government. Hatred is born of ignorance. Fear is its father, and isolation is its mother. And when you put those two together, when people don't know who other people in their communities are, and I'm talking about a larger global community, they become scared. And when they're scared, they tend to marginalize those people. And I think we all know that this has been happening for centuries. I was told that diversity was a code word for white genocide. I was told that black people were coming into my neighborhood to commit crime and to rape our women. I was told that Latinos were bringing drugs into our community. And I was told that Jewish people controlled the media and the banking systems. And that created a fear in me that I just could not reconcile. So I turned to hate. I saw it as the last desperate measure to be able to control what I perceived at that time as an attack against the white race. And I willingly went along because I had left everything behind that meant anything to me. I left my family behind, I left my friends behind, and everything that I loved for this new family. Because that's what they do. They get you to cut off the ties from everything else so that you belong to them, and then they can control you with their propaganda and with their activities of anti-Semitism. I learned very, very quickly that music was the most powerful propaganda tool to recruit young people. So I started to make music. In fact, I was in one of America's first neo-Nazi skinhead bands. And this is a picture in Weimar, Germany, of me at 17 years old performing in front of 4,000 neo-Nazi skinheads from all over Europe. And then something changed. I met a girl, and I fell in love, and we had a child. And if anybody here has a child, they'll understand what I'm saying. When I first held my son, it was magic. I was able to reconnect with the innocence that I lost at 14 years old, and I was able to remember who I was supposed to be. Even though our mantra in the white supremacist movement was the 14 words, we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children, when I held my child in my arms, I knew that I didn't want him to be anywhere near what I was a part of. Bless you. And then I started to meet people that I'd kept outside of my social circle. I started to meet African Americans and gay people and Jewish people. And I started to realize that there were more similarities between us than there were differences. What I had been taught and what I had believed and what I had taught other people started to not make sense anymore. In fact, I was receiving compassion and empathy when I least deserved it from the people that I least deserved it from. And that destroyed the isolation, the bubble that I'd created around myself. Now, in 2009, I co-founded an organization called Life After Hate, which is made up of all former right-wing extremists who have spent the last 20 years committed to helping people leave hate groups. We're the only organization in North America that's run by formers who are focused on the far right. And since 2009, in the 6 years that we've been together, we've managed to build a network of 75 former neo-Nazis, KKK, who have all committed their lives to helping destroy what they helped create. Just last year, we launched a program called Exit USA. It functions much like a suicide hotline, where people can contact us confidentially through our website or a phone number, through text message, if they themselves are in a hate group and want help getting out, because it is so difficult to leave, to start over. And we want to be that support group for those people, because I know how hard it was. I went through a depression of 5 years after I left the movement, where every morning I wanted to wake up and kill myself. Because even though my heart had changed and I started to treat people with respect, I did not treat myself with respect. So we want to be that bridge to help people leave, and it's also available for family members, for parents and loved ones who have somebody in their family who may be going down that path. I just want to talk for 2 more minutes. This is what hate used to look like when I was involved, and I think when we talk about hate groups or hateful ideology, this is what we think about. But I can tell you that 25 years ago, there was a concerted effort called leaderless resistance that taught people in our movement, and I taught it as well, that we needed to mainstream our ideology. We needed to not shave our heads and get tattoos. We needed to wear a suit and a tie and mainstream and blend in and take the message of hate and anti-Semitism and polish it a little bit so it was more palatable to the mainstream. And I'm sorry to say that today it is flourishing in something called the alt-right and white nationalism. There really is no difference between what was a National Socialist in 1933 or 1945 to what is happening in our country and in fact all across Europe today. We're seeing growth in far-right groups. We're seeing politicians become elected who are clearly in the alt-right camp, or in many cases even open neo-Nazis or white nationalists. And this is what they look like now. They look like our sons and our daughters, and they live on the internet. And there are thousands and thousands of these people who are spreading propaganda and misinformation to recruit more young people. And they are getting younger and younger. And they look like this guy, who walked into a church in South Carolina and murdered 9 innocent people. This man was a product of this internet alt-right phenomenon that we're seeing now. We cannot ignore it. We all know that hate crimes and hate groups exist, but I'm here to tell you that while we've been so focused on Islamist extremists for so many years now, that the real problem that already lives in our country is a problem of domestic terrorism, because in fact since 9/11, more white supremacists or people tied to white nationalist groups have killed more people than any foreign or domestic terrorist group combined, probably by a factor of 10. Yet we don't talk about this, and I fear that with our election and with January 20th fast approaching, that conversation of focusing on far-right domestic extremism will be off the table. And it's up to people like you to make sure that that does not happen. I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you. The ADL does amazing work, and they have for 100 years. And it's never been more important than right now. And it's never been so relevant that never is now.
Jesse Morton is a reformed former extremist who was once a prominent radicalizer in the West. As a co-founder and chief propagandist of Revolution Muslim, a New York City-based group active in the 2000s, he helped insert the narrative of Al-Qaeda and Salafi jihadist ideology into the American ambit. Morton had direct contact with some of the most prominent extremist preachers in the West, including Abdul Faisal, Omar Bakri Muhammad, and several others. After his incarceration in 2011, Morton de-radicalized, and today he rejects Salafi jihadi and Islamist ideology. He actively assisted the law enforcement community in several investigations of domestic and international terrorism. At the same time, he helped develop tools for assessment and analysis, techniques for early intervention and counter-messaging. Thus, his original 11-and-a-half-year sentence was reduced to less than 4 years. As a research fellow currently at the Program on Extremism at George Washington University, Morton focuses on issues such as the propaganda of terrorist organizations, Islamic and jihadist ideology, countering radicalization and extremism, and promoting disengagement. He considers this work an opportunity to repair some of the damage caused by his radicalization. Jesse, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. Again, my name is Jesse Morton, but for many years, I lived as Yunus Abdullah Muhammad, a name that was given to me when I converted to Islam. By all accounts of my life experience, I should have been an all-American boy. My father is from Cranford, New Jersey, right outside of the city. His father was a prominent attorney in New Jersey, set to be the youngest Supreme Court justice in the state. My family, on my father's side, goes all the way back to the Mountain Mayflower. And I am a direct descendant of John Adams. I am from a family that is the sons and daughters of the American Revolution. So my mother's side of the family is from Pennsylvania, and they were a working class family, relatively poor, agriculturalist turned industrialist. At 40 years old, my father's father, my would-be grandfather, died unexpectedly. And my father had his own certain traumatic experience. At the time, it was the late 60s movement, the countercultural movement of the late 60s, and my father moved to a small town to become what they called then a hippie or a beatnik. And his idea was to drop out of society altogether. And so when I was born, I was born on a farm in Pennsylvania. We grew our own food. My father grew marijuana in the woodshed. And I listened to the same music that was a byproduct of the 60s. However, due to the fact that my father was an adulterer, and due to the fact that my mother had probably undiagnosed mental illness, I grew up in a very traumatizing experience as a child. My mother would bite me, she would kick me, she would scratch me, she would choke me. And at a certain point, after going to family members and trying to get intervention, and no one intervening, I went to the school guidance counselor. I showed him bite marks on my arms, and I showed him the pinch marks on my cheeks. They called my mother in, and my mother said that my brother and me had gotten in a fight over the weekend. Over the years, I got traumatized. And of course, by going to community members and continuing to ask community members for intervention and not getting it, what happened was I rejected my own society. I absolutely developed a complete mistrust for the United States, for America, for West, whatever you want to call it. And at the age of 16, I couldn't take it anymore. The abuse got too psychologically difficult to bear, and I ran away. Close to here, 42nd Street, right behind Port Authority, there's a drop-in center that's called the Open Door. It recently closed, but I started there, living on the streets. I imitated my father, and for many years I traveled with a rock and roll band called the Grateful Dead. I adopted countercultural movements, I became an ultra-liberal, and I also found myself as an intellectually inquisitive individual, sitting in libraries in Berkeley, California, or even here in New York Public Library System and reading radical leftists like Noam Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein, reading the protocols of the Elders of Zion, reading conspiracy theories about the New World Order and the Jews that control the entire world. So before I even converted to Islam, I was politicized, I was revolutionary, and I held a conspiratorial view that was very anti-Semitic, I realize today, and fraudulent, completely fraudulent. After living a very criminal lifestyle on the streets, I was incarcerated in a county jail in State College, Pennsylvania. At that point, I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, and I related completely with his story. He had a traumatic background, progressed to criminal behavior, went to jail, transformed his life, became a Muslim, first part of the Nation of Islam, and then at the end of the book he talks about going to Mecca and circumambulating the Kaaba there with white, blue-eyed devils like myself. And I opened up to the idea that an organized religion that I once rejected might be something to latch on to. And I started to seek, started to find a new identity because the ultra-liberalism was destroying me piece by piece. In Richmond City Jail, I met a Moroccan who was a veteran of the Afghan Soviet Jihad. He taught me Islam, and he told me one day to go wash every single inch of my body in the shower. And that when I came out, he was going to make me a new person. Because once I converted to Islam, everything I did in the past was done with. I went, I washed my body, I came out, and he gave me a new name, Yunus Abdullah Muhammad. One day, he was praying, and a man walked in front of our prayer, and there's a hadith or a statement from the Prophet Muhammad that says if someone walks in front of your prayer, gently move him with your hand, and if he doesn't move, then stand up and fight him, for he's a devil. That individual got up and fought somebody 3 times his size, and he got humiliated. He got beat very badly. And so at the end of that conflict, he called me to the back of the cell, and he gave me another statement from the Prophet Muhammad. He told me that in Afghanistan, the Taliban had established Islamic law. And he narrated something that said that the black flag, the flag that we see so prominent today with ISIS, would start in Khorasan, which the jihadists interpret as Afghanistan, and it would not be stopped until it reached Jerusalem. And he taught me that the Muslims were engaged in a never-ending war of good versus evil from the Muslims against the kuffar, against the non-believers. And he gave me something that allowed me to be a protagonist in a spiritual war. It gave me an identity. I was now Yunus Abdullah Muhammad, and I was now enthralled. It was before 9/11. So by the time 9/11 happened, I was completely desensitized and viewed it as a fulfillment of the prophecy that this man gave me. I had totally transformed my life. I had structure through prayer, structure through fasting, structure through learning. I was progressing as an individual. I found myself in Harlem on 145th Street in Edgecombe, living in a shelter at first, but getting a scholarship to go to Metropolitan College of New York on Varick Street. I eventually graduated from Columbia with a master's degree in international affairs. But at the same time, I was living dual lives. One as Yunus Abdullah Muhammad, and the other as Jesse Morton. As Yunus Abdullah Muhammad, I started in Harlem. And there I was exposed to the Nation of Islam, which is also incredibly anti-Semitic, as everyone in this room knows. Again, the idea that the Jewish conspiracy, that the Jewish bankers, that the Jewish media, that the Jewish corporate ownership was running the world, that they were actually leading the United States, was a dominant theme and a dominant narrative. And it was an incredibly mobilizing factor as I would stand on 125th Street as the blonde blue devil and preach about Islam and the Iraqi war. And people would stop. And so I began to be enthralled by the fact that I could motivate others with speech. People would go to the mosque, they would convert, people would talk to me about politics, and I progressed. I found a group at a Muslim Day Parade here in New York in approximately 2005 called the Islamic Thinkers Society. They're an offshoot of a group called Al-Muhajirun, which is one of the most notorious radicalizing and recruitment agencies in Britain, and it has some influence in most English-speaking countries. And I participated in that movement and adopted the Salafi Jihadi ideology. I studied it thoroughly, I learned Arabic, I started to understand more about the politics as I was studying secular sciences at school. And what we did was we used anti-Semitism to completely mobilize and insert the narrative of the time of Al-Qaeda into the American ambit, probably for the first time. We did heinous things with anti-Semitism. For example, an associate of mine at the annual Israeli Day Parade once held a sign that said, "Kill all Jews," J-U-I-C-E, to stay out of prison. When I first met them, they took me to a mosque in Woodbridge. They picked up a laptop, and the first thing that they showed me was dead Palestinians, in order to instruct me that what Osama bin Laden said was true. Right? Osama bin Laden constantly at that time, before ISIS, every piece of the rhetoric, every piece of the propaganda was directed at Israel as a mobilizing factor to try to encourage Arabs and now people in the West to join the cause. At the time, we were less concerned about Al-Qaeda-led operations, and Al-Qaeda leadership was telling us in the United States to propagate their message, that they were moving to a leaderless resistance model like Christian talked about. And so we took up the cause. I was affiliated in written correspondence with the imam that radicalized Jermaine Lindsay, one of the 7/7 bombers, Abdullah Faisal. He was deported in early 2007 to Jamaica, and he was actually incarcerated for a vitriolic lecture he called No Peace with the Jews. And the same thing about the Rothschild banking conspiracies, and all of that was a cornerstone of his own preaching, and it helped lead to the 7/7 bombings. I was also affiliated with my best friend at the time, whose name is Yusuf al-Khattab. Yusuf al-Khattab was an Orthodox Jew who lived in Israel, converted to Islam, walked into Palestinian territory, and became an advocate, a radical activist on behalf of the Muslim Brotherhood first. He moved to the United States, and he had adopted al-Qaeda's views. Myself, Abdullah Faisal, and Yusuf al-Khattab utilized anti-Semitic rhetoric as part and parcel of bringing the message of al-Qaeda to the United States. Long story short, we were responsible for many of the terrorist attacks that occurred in the United States as the leaderless resistance model started to take a hold. As we saw the rise in leaderless resistance and homegrown violent extremism, they started to connect perpetrators to my organization. In 2010, somebody used my website to post a threat against the writers of South Park, and I ate it up. I loved it. So I participated in a conspiracy that stretched all the way to getting Pakistan to shut down Facebook for a day, and getting death threats against the woman who started Everybody Draw Muhammad Day in Seattle by Anwar al-Awlaki and Samir Khan, my associates in Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. A template for a magazine that we set up here called Jihad Recollections. The first issue was of Inspire magazine from Anwar al-Awlaki and Samir Khan, was dedicated to making a death threat against this woman. And then also that's where the article, How to Build a Bomb in Your Mom's Kitchen, stemmed from. I'm responsible for a great amount of violence through speech. And I think that that's appropriate when we talk about anti-Semitism, because it's such a rallying cry, whether you talk about the conspiracy theories of the right, whether you talk about the Islamists, or even now that we look at the potential for far leftists to come back into the realm of our awareness with regard to violence and violent extremism. Every single component of extremism certainly plays off of the anti-Semitic message. Ultimately, I was arrested in Morocco. And my story of de-radicalization is a long one. When I moved to Morocco to run away from the US federal government's potential charges against me, I taught English, I tutored, I met with Arab millennial youth at banks, teaching them how to do foreign direct investment. And it was in the context of the Arab Spring. And I realized that the utopian Islamic state that I wanted was not what the general people in the Arab world wanted. And I also found that they were pretty fascinating people. And it started to plant a seed of doubt in me, as in the context of the Arab Spring, they started to talk about how much they desired human rights, democracy, liberalism, and etc. From there, I moved onto a realm where the propaganda of Osama bin Laden wasn't resonating as it once was. It started to make me doubt some of the things he was saying. He issued a statement, for example, on global warming. I thought it was absolutely absurd. I was arrested in Morocco 2 weeks after he was killed on a street in Casablanca. And I spent 5 months in a Moroccan jail where I met Salafi jihadis that I once thought understood Islam, understood politics, understood a vision for the society, and they were completely ignorant. They had no knowledge of current affairs, no knowledge of their religion. That shook me. And then, by the time I was picked up by private plane and extradited rendition style back to the United States, a Secret Service agent asked me whether I wanted to be called Yunus Abdullah Muhammad or Jesse Morton. And somewhere from deep inside of me, I said Jesse Morton. And that's what started another step towards standing here today in front of you. I spent time in solitary confinement when I returned to Alexandria, Virginia, and I was able, through the help of a late night guard, third shift guard, 40 hours a week, 10 hours, 4 hours a day, to be taken to a library where she would allow me to stay and read. And I read Enlightenment thinkers, Jacques Rousseau, John Locke, John Stuart Mill, and particularly the founding fathers of the United States. It was through that I started to reconnect with a Western identity. It was through that I started to realize the value of rational thought, reason over faith. When I met the FBI to do my debriefing process after pleading guilty, I found that there was a female agent she humanized me. She didn't treat me like the scumbag that I was, that the other agents saw me as. And ultimately, long story short, I started to realize that the us versus them world that I lived in was completely incorrect. It added grays where there were none before. Like Oren said, sometime later I was released early after cooperation with law enforcement and yielding some significant gains. During the time that I was cooperating while I was in prison clandestinely, I was able to revisit the Islamic texts through a post-Enlightenment lens and totally transformed the way that I saw the religion I had adopted. I came home from prison in March of 2015. I sustained cooperation and I researched and sought out connections so that I could stand in front of people like this, talk about my experiences, and become a former extremist in the American ambit. And probably the very first former Islamist extremist to come public. And now I'm at George Washington University's program on extremism, conducting research in the realm of extremism and particularly Islamist extremism. And it's a great honor for me to be here because, as Oren said, I think that the most comprehensive work and investigatory work that was up to date on Revolution Muslim, Jesse Morton or Yunus Abdullah Muhammad, was the ADL. They had some of the most thorough reporting. And I think that they were the organization that was most frequently contacting the US government and telling them that they needed to intervene with what we were doing. And ultimately, I think that they had some influence on my being charged for communication of threats. And I have to honestly say that if there wasn't pressure, like from groups like the ADL, to silence people like me, not only would more people be hurt, but I wouldn't be standing here in front of you today with an opportunity to make amends for the damage that I've caused. So I think it's really important when we look at the situation that we face going forward. I have a very, very serious symbiotic relationship between extremist groups that is going to allow them to breed and feed off of each other. And so I think that every single individual, not just former extremists, has to play their role. And I think that everybody in this room understands that and realizes that. And I only hope that my story can help people understand better the threats that we face. It's not something to be taken lightly, as we all know. Thank you very much for having me.
So the question that I have is, as you guys have gone through this process, and I felt like what is compelling about you, beyond your honesty and willing to share this information, is that a lot of this is not about the extremist ideology. It's not about the hatred. It's about the other factors, the personal factors. So I just wanted to, as you both I know have spoken before, how do you see that? How big of a role is that indeed? And when we're trying to mitigate these threats, we can't just look at what the propaganda says. We're trying to identify people.
Yeah. No, and what Jesse said is absolutely correct, and what Oren said is correct. There are so many similarities between extremisms of different stripes that it really comes down to three things. People join extremist groups not because of the ideology, but they do so because of a sense of belonging, a sense of identity, and a sense of purpose. And at least what they perceive to be purpose. And the motivations for joining are the same, but I would also say that the motivations for leaving are the same. And we can apply the same type of exit strategies for somebody who is a jihadist or somebody who's a white supremacist. And I just want to kind of close that comment by saying that it's just a matter of time before we see far-right extremists and jihadist extremists working together. And that may sound crazy, but if you think about it, the common thread is that they hate Jewish people, they hate Israel, and they hate US government. And I can tell you from experience in 1991, I was contacted by people who represented Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, who asked that I travel to Libya to accept money to fund American revolution against the Jews. So, I mean, this is not just conjecture. This is something that's happened. It wouldn't surprise me one bit if it's happening on a larger scale. But that's something I think we need to be very, very careful of.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you talk about the identification of individuals rather than just addressing the ideology, I mean, what you want to look for in identification and early identification of individuals that pose a risk is the synthesis between the two. I do argue that ideology is the mobilizing factor. And I do think that the majority of work has to be done in regard to rejecting that ideology and coming up with ways to assess where an individual lies on a continuum between adherence to radical ideologies and countering violent extremism, whether it's far right, far left, or Islamist groupings. However, I think that when you see adherence to an ideology to a degree where there's a a belief in terrorism or belief in the justification for violence, and then you see that synthesized with personal background factors like come through when you hear a story from Christian or myself, I think that that is definitely a way that you can assess risk. And I think it's true. I mean, twofold factors. The realm of countering violent extremism, I think, if it's done properly, can have a big effect with regard to prevention, counter-messaging, interdiction, peer-to-peer contacts, and working alongside law enforcement to give them other mechanisms of measurement. These are all things that I've sort of started to work on. I've only been public for 2 months. So this is all new, but I have several years of experience collaborating with law enforcement and talking about these topics. And this is on the tip of everyone's tongue. How much of a role does personal traumatic background and experiences play versus the role of ideology? I don't think you can separate the two. Many people with trauma never go on to adopt the radical ideology. What we need to do is be able to develop mechanisms to measure how far along a person is in the adoption of that ideology. And that requires understanding the nuances, but also the similarities between